Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Some inquiries, once undertaken, cannot be retracted. They pull not only at the fabric of our understanding, but at something deeper, ancestral, biological, submerged in the folds of blood memory. This investigation is not merely into a story, nor even a myth, but into a lineage that fictionally dissolved nearly a century ago, and yet, curiously, has never entirely vanished. We speak of Innsmouth, the isolated New England town extinguished by a supposed government raid in 1928. But official accounts fail to hold, whispers persist, bloodlines stretch forward, and in many families, perhaps even yours, the Innsmouth look has yet to fade. We must recognize that what Lovecraft wrote in The Shadow over Innsmouth was not just narrative, it was revelation cloaked in invention. Published in the early 1930s, during a period of great anxiety about identity, purity, and decline, the story fused eugenic paranoia with maritime folklore and theological collapse. Its implications were not merely symbolic, but structural. The idea that some heresies are hereditary, that monstrosity is not adopted but inherited, and that secrecy is a survival strategy passed from parent to child. To understand the origins of the Innsmouth cults, we must first return to the decades that gave them narrative birth. The 1920s and 1930s, when America's cultural shoreline was retreating from its own ideals. Lovecraft's New England, though superficially a relic of colonial piety and wailing prosperity, had already begun its transformation into a symbolic graveyard for the American mind. In the wake of the First World War, amid fears of degeneration and immigration, Lovecraft transformed the anxieties of a nation into the language of aquatic decay. The sea, once an emblem of transcendence, became an archive of corruption. Consider this carefully. In The Shadow over Innsmouth, the drowned town does not merely evoke maritime isolation, it reconstructs the moral geography of a civilization terrified of its own mixture. Lovecraft's intent, though never fully conscious, emerges as an act of purification through myth, an attempt to contain the idea that ancestry might be porous, mutable, and profane. The socio-political atmosphere of Lovecraft's time cannot be separated from the mythos he constructed. The 1920s were steeped in the rhetoric of eugenics, with legislation like the 1924 Immigration Act echoing through New England's dying towns. Lovecraft, a man of fragile health and inherited elitism, projected the fear of dilution into his fiction, turning biological anxiety into cosmological allegory. The inhabitants of Innsmouth, half human, half something older, embody the collapse of rigid taxonomy. They are not outsiders invading civilization, they are civilization's secret continuation. We must recognize that Lovecraft's horror lies not in contamination, but in recognition that humanity's boundaries are already eroded by the deep past it pretends to forget. The Great Depression deepened the shadow over New England, transforming real fishing towns into ghostly approximations of themselves. Abandoned wharves, shuttered refineries, and empty churches offered Lovecraft more than setting. They became archaeological traces of a once devout people who had traded spirit for survival. The cult of Dagon was thus born not from excess faith, but from desperation. When Lovecraft wrote of merchants turning to the sea for prosperity and strange idols, he was drawing from a genuine economic ritual, the Faustian bargain between industrial decline and the unknown. It is not mere superstition he depicts, but a grim anthropology of collapse. The deep ones are not external monsters. They are the submerged expression of a dying economy's prayer for renewal, proof that faith persists even when directed toward the abyss. At a literary level, Lovecraft's treatment of Innsmouth marks a shift from Gothic isolation to anthropological dread. Earlier horror, Poe, Hawthorne, Stoker, located evil in individuals or families. Lovecraft relocated it to the collective, to the genetic and historical strata beneath community life. The town itself becomes a living organism, its decay organic, its religion metabolic. When he visited decaying ports like Marblehead or Newburyport, Lovecraft saw them through double vision, as picturesque relics of colonial virtue and as festering symbols of spiritual entropy. His letters reveal fascination tinged with disgust, an oscillation between preservation and purgation. Thus, Innsmouth's fictional geography becomes the psychological map of a man trapped between antiquarian reverence and existential nausea. It is not nostalgia, but necromancy, the attempt to commune with the corpse of civilization and call it history. We must pause here to consider Lovecraft's curious atheism, for it underlies the paradox at the heart of his myth-making. Though a self-professed materialist, he wrote with the rigor of a theologian deprived of divinity. In the absence of God, he substituted a cosmology of indifference, in place of salvation, inheritance. His deities, Cthulhu, Dagon, Hydra, do not demand worship but recognition. They do not promise eternity but reveal its futility. In this way, Lovecraft's intent mirrors his century's disillusionment. Faith replaced by biology, grace by genealogy, the soul by the sequence. The cults of Innsmouth therefore embody not belief in monsters, but resignation to descent. They are liturgies performed by those who understand that to be human is to be temporary, transitional, and ultimately amphibious. If Lovecraft's contemporaries sought stability in scientific progress, his fiction exposed the irony of that pursuit. Anthropology, archaeology, and biology, all the great empirical sciences, become instruments of unmaking in his work. Each discipline, when applied too deeply, uncovers the same conclusion. Humanity is not unique, but contingent, not ascendant, but recursive. The 1928 raid on Innsmouth by federal agents, fictional though it is, symbolizes the intrusion of modern rationality upon ancient continuity. It is not a victory of order over chaos, but of denial over truth. The government suppresses what it cannot assimilate, just as society suppresses the knowledge that its origins lie not in heaven, but in the tide pool. Lovecraft's intent, whether he acknowledged it or not, was to reveal that civilization itself is a form of containment, temporary, fragile, and destined to erode. To properly apprehend the significance of the Innsmouth cults, we must look beyond the confines of Lovecraft's personal history and into the deep well of older cultural and philosophical traditions upon which his mythos silently draws. The town of Innsmouth, with its ritual secrecy, hereditary transformation, and maritime devotion, is not an isolated fiction. It is a distorted echo of countless earlier systems of belief. From the sacrificial tides of the Phoenicians to the amphibious gods of Mesopotamia, the symbolic language of sea worship forms a long, unbroken current. Consider carefully. The deep ones are not simply monsters of Lovecraft's invention. They are part of a larger archetypal lineage, one that has appeared under many names: Oans, Dagon, Atargatis, gods that emerged from the ocean not to terrorize, but to instruct, to bless, and to claim. This reveals something profound. Innsmouth is not a deviation from human religion, but its unconscious recurrence in grotesque form. The figure of Dagon, whom the Innsmouth cult venerates, is attested as early as the 3rd millennium BCE in Sumerian and Akkadian records, later appearing in the Philistine pantheon as both grain deity and maritime power. In the Book of Judges, Dagon's temple collapses upon its priests, yet in earlier texts his iconography suggests hybridization. Part man, part fish, intermediary between two realms. Lovecraft did not invent this dualism, he reactivated it. The deep ones, immortal and subaqueous, embody the same theological function as Dagon, beings that confer forbidden wisdom, demand biological submission, and dissolve the boundary between human and divine. This is not simply literary borrowing, it is mythic continuation. By situating Dagon in Innsmouth, Lovecraft unconsciously participates in a long-standing tradition of liminal deities, those who emerge from the unknown to blur the line between creature and god, man and ancestry. Maritime cultures have long held ambiguous relationships with the ocean. It is a source of nourishment, mystery, and terror. Among the Greeks, the sea god Proteus was a shapeshifter, a prophetic but elusive figure associated with hidden knowledge. In Polynesian myth, Tangaroa ruled the oceans and was worshipped as progenitor of marine life and, by some accounts, humanity itself. These deities, fluid, ancestral, unknowable, represent a philosophical orientation radically different from monotheism. They are not omnipotent or moral, but elemental and cyclical. The worshippers of Innsmouth echo this logic. They do not pray to a creator who stands apart from the world, but to ancient beings within it. Creatures whose authority derives not from ethics, but from biology and time. It is not salvation they seek, but return. This philosophical model upends the dominant Western teleology. Instead of progress toward heaven, there is regression toward origin. Instead of resurrection, there is mutation. Instead of grace, inheritance. One must not underestimate the influence of ancient mystery religions on Lovecraft's structuring of cultic devotion. In Eleusinian, Orphic, and Mithraic rites, the initiate undergoes ritual death and symbolic rebirth, a transformation meant to link them with the divine source. The Innsmouth cult mirrors this with startling precision. The final stages of hybridization are not viewed as horror by the initiated, but as apotheosis. The narrator of The Shadow over Innsmouth ultimately embraces his destiny, not as a curse, but as homecoming. This arc echoes the Gnostic idea that knowledge of one's true origin, however alien, leads to liberation. Yet the liberation offered here is grotesque, a sinking back into the womb of the world, an undoing of individuality in favor of species memory. We must recognize this inversion. The cult does not promise transcendence, but immanence. The divine is not above, but below. It is not light, but depth. The philosophical implications of this are unsettling. Where classical Western thought elevated reason and separation from nature, the Innsmouth model enshrines dissolution and return. In Platonic thought, knowledge elevates the soul away from the world of change. In Innsmouth, knowledge reveals that change is the soul. The cult's rituals, their breeding pacts, their silent devotions beneath the waves, all speak to a philosophy in which time is circular, blood is sacred, and the self is temporary. This directly contradicts Enlightenment ideals of autonomy, individuality, and rational control. Here, control is illusion, biology is destiny. The ocean does not explain, it absorbs. In this view, myth is not a means of ordering reality, but of surrendering to it. And once this orientation is accepted, resistance itself becomes a kind of madness. One does not escape the deep ones. One becomes them. There is also an undercurrent of sacrificial logic at play, drawn from ancient fertility rites and maritime superstitions. Coastal communities across cultures, Norse, Celtic, Japanese, developed traditions of sea appeasement, offering lives or rituals to pacify the abyss. In Innsmouth, the sacrifices take the form of intermarriage and secrecy. The townspeople do not merely serve the deep ones, they bind themselves to them through blood. This reflects a broader mythological principle. That order requires communion with chaos. It is not the denial of the monstrous that preserves society, but its incorporation. The Innsmouth cults operate within this logic, making pacts not to destroy the alien, but to embody it. It is not a fall from grace. It is a merger with something older than grace. In this, we see how myth functions not to moralize, but to explain continuity. Across generations, across species, across gods and their human vessels. Rather than treating Lovecraft's creation as unique, it is more fruitful to understand it as a modern incarnation of enduring themes: return, inheritance, threshold. The deep ones are not new gods, but old fears with new masks. What sets Innsmouth apart is not the strangeness of its cult, but the familiarity of its logic. It draws on universal mythic structures and reorients them toward entropy rather than redemption. The townspeople are not possessed, they are preserved. Their rituals do not corrupt, they remember. And so, we arrive at the language they use to do so, for in the next section we will examine the etymology and symbolic vocabulary through which the cults of Innsmouth encoded their beliefs, their lineage, and their longing to return to the sea. Every mythology develops its own lexicon, a specialized vocabulary through which sacred truths are encrypted, preserved, and transmitted. In the case of Innsmouth, Lovecraft deploys a precise and resonant etymology that reinforces the uncanny depth of the story's world. Words like Yaha-Nthlay, Dagon, and Hydra do not merely ornament the text, they encode its metaphysics. The language of the Deep Ones functions as both symbol and signal, marking the border where the human tongue falters and something older begins to speak. Consider this carefully. The very name Innsmouth acts as a portmanteau of geography and theological implication. It is not simply a coastal town. It is an entryway, a mouth inwards. The prefix in evokes internality, enclosure, perhaps even infection, while mouth implies both communication and consumption. Thus the town becomes a living organ, speaking, swallowing, whispering. This is not accidental. It is the linguistic equivalent of architectural foreshadowing. Lovecraft's use of Dagon is equally layered. On the surface, it appears to be an arbitrary selection from Near Eastern mythology, yet its placement reveals deliberate thematic excavation. Historically, Dagon was associated with grain and fertility in Mesopotamian and Levantine cultures, but his later marine reinterpretation, especially in Philistine contexts, makes him a liminal figure, existing between land and sea. The Hebrew root dag, meaning fish, reinforces this aquatic identity. When Lovecraft appropriated the name in his early story, Dagon, 1919, he initiated a process of linguistic transformation. Dagon becomes not a god of agriculture, but of reversion, of man returning to a primordial aquatic state. The shift from fertility to hybridization is not a mere inversion, but a philosophical evolution. Dagon ceases to be a god of life and becomes a god of before. It is not growth he promises, but return. The cult's use of his name is thus not worshipful, but contractual. They do not venerate him as divine, but claim him as ancestor. The term Yaha-Nthle, designating the Deep One city beneath Devil Reef, demands special attention. Its phonology evokes both alienness and ritual rhythm, a series of glottal breaks and open vowels that resist assimilation into English pronunciation. This is no accident. Lovecraft crafts such names to simulate the pre-human. The city's name functions like a linguistic reef, beautiful in form, but dangerous to navigate. As scholar S.T. Joshi notes, these invented words are not just aesthetic devices. They simulate what he called a phonetic archaeology. Conjuring languages evolved not from Indo-European roots, but from something evolutionary divergent. This reveals something crucial. The mythos cannot be named comfortably, and thus cannot be contained. Language, in Innsmouth, is not a tool of clarity, but an index of distance. The further one delves into the cult's terminology, the more the lexicon disintegrates into guttural incantation. It is not a vocabulary of enlightenment, but of mutation. Symbolically, the language of the Deep Ones is charged with aquatic logic. Words flow, break, bubble. Repeated patterns mimic tides, ebbing consonants, crashing vowels, undulating syllables. This is not merely poetic ornament, it is structure. The cult's liturgical speech mirrors the ocean's cycles, reinforcing their identity not through grammar, but through rhythm. This mirrors older esoteric traditions in which sacred words were not read but chanted, not parsed but performed. The pronunciation of Yaha-Nthle or Hydra is itself a sacrament. Sound becomes offering. Compare this to the ancient Egyptian concept of Heikau, words of power that shaped reality. The Innsmouth cult's tongue functions similarly. The utterance of names like Dagon or Hydra is not description, but invocation. Language here is not denotative, but performative. To speak is to align, to name is to remember, and to mispronounce is to resist. Thus, the true horror is not in hearing the names, but in realizing one can say them at all. The motif of the Innsmouth look also operates as a symbolic lexeme, one rooted not in spoken language, but in physiognomy. The cult's vocabulary extends beyond words to features, bulging eyes, receding chins, gill-like necks. These are not metaphors, they are morphology as scripture. Each face becomes a glyph of hidden descent, a sentence inscribed in the cartilage and flesh. Just as sacred texts encode theology in written form, the bodies of Innsmouth's residents encode a gospel of blood. This is a symbolic language with no need of literacy. Anyone can read the truth in a sealed glance. It is not written in books, but inherited through cheekbones, skin texture, and gait. We must recognize that this physical vocabulary renders denial impossible. There is no forgetting, no secrecy, when the body itself becomes a revelation. In this way, the cult's symbolic language is inescapable. It is both uttered and worn. Rhetorically, Lovecraft intensifies the atmosphere of the cults by embedding corrupted linguistic forms into the narrative voice. Consider the narrator's slow shift in perception throughout The Shadow over Innsmouth. As he moves deeper into the town, the descriptions become increasingly permeated with unfamiliar terms and fractured syntax. This is not mere stylistic choice. It reflects epistemological erosion. Language, once precise and observational, begins to collapse under the weight of inherited dread. The narrator's own words begin to stutter, as if infected by the very reality they describe. This is where Lovecraft's genius becomes most evident. The horror is not only in what is seen, but in how language fails to mediate it. Communication itself becomes porous. Vocabulary becomes virulent. And once infected, the speaker becomes part of the myth. Etymology, then, becomes revelation. Through name, rhythm, and form, Lovecraft encodes a world that cannot be fully expressed in human terms. The Innsmouth cults do not possess a sacred text. They possess a sacred morphology, a pattern that echoes through speech, through flesh, through architecture and memory. In the next section, we turn to this architecture of belief, how the myth was rendered believable not by assertion, but by technique, through myth-building and narrative authenticity that blurred fiction with anthropology and left behind the unmistakable weight of truth disguised as lore. To comprehend the disturbing persistence of the Innsmouth cults, one must explore not merely what Lovecraft wrote, but how he made it feel real. The effectiveness of The Shadow over Innsmouth lies in its remarkable narrative authenticity, the deliberate construction of a myth that mimics the techniques of ethnography, local history, and institutional documentation. Unlike traditional horror, which often leans on supernatural spectacle, Lovecraft embeds the cult's existence within the recognizable frameworks of reportage, travelogue, and bureaucratic cover-up. The result is a fiction that feels archival. It is not framed as invention, but as recovered record, something found, not imagined. We must recognize that this is no minor detail of style. It is the very mechanism by which myth becomes indistinguishable from suppressed history. Lovecraft's narrator operates not as a victim, but as a researcher. He enters Innsmouth with rational detachment, documenting local rumors, inspecting urban decay, and referencing official sources. His tone is not emotional, but analytical. This creates a sense of credibility that resists easy dismissal. The narrator cites bus, schedules, factory names, architectural details, even the linguistic peculiarities of local dialects. These minutiae serve not as atmospheric padding, but as evidentiary texture. The cult's strangeness is framed through bureaucratic realism, which paradoxically deepens the horror. It is not a dreamscape, it is New England, and in that contrast between the mundane and the mythic, Lovecraft manufactures dread not through the unknown, but through the verifiable. As readers, we are not asked to suspend disbelief. We are asked to document it. Crucially, Lovecraft employs the technique of pseudo-ethnography, a method in which fictional peoples and rituals are presented with the detached objectivity of anthropological study. The cult of Dagon is described in terms of custom, lineage, and oral tradition. Their ceremonies are not demonic, but anthropologically plausible, blending Polynesian fertility rites, Masonic secrecy, and American maritime folklore. The deep ones are not magical invaders, but evolutionary kin. The effect is insidious. Rather than shocking us with the inexplicable, Lovecraft seduces us with a system. He does not invent horror, he reconstructs it. In doing so, he taps into the same machinery of belief that fuels real-world myth-making, detail, repetition, and the illusion of empirical neutrality. This is not a story, it is a dossier, and that distinction changes everything. Another pillar of narrative authenticity is the use of invented but interlinked source texts. Names like the Necronomicon, the Esoteric Order of Dagon, or the Pnakotic manuscripts function as fictional references with consistent internal logic. They recur across multiple stories, appear in footnotes, and are sometimes attributed to named, fictional scholars. This intertextual scaffolding simulates the structure of genuine academic or theological discourse. Consider the way sacred texts are treated in Abrahamic traditions, with commentary, translation, and disputed provenance. Lovecraft mirrors this scholarly apparatus to lend weight to his creations. The The cult of Innsmouth does not exist in isolation. It is cross-referenced, footnoted, and distributed across a mythological network. Its reality is reinforced not by proximity to fact, but by density of fiction. Even the geography is calculated for plausibility. Innsmouth is placed near real towns, Newburyport, Ipswich, Gloucester, all of which contribute regional credibility. Lovecraft's fanatical attention to topographical realism grounds the cult in a physical place one might locate on a map. This is not the vague nowhere of fairy tale, but the haunted somewhere of corrupted history. The town's design, its abandoned refineries, its decaying churches, its blasphemous reef, resembles actual patterns of economic decline in early 20th century coastal America. This is not fantasy, it is decay annotated. By placing his myth in recognizable surroundings, Lovecraft disarms skepticism. He does not say, "All this happened." He says, "This could not have happened, had one simply looked closer." Perhaps the most disturbing element of Lovecraft's myth-building is the illusion of suppression. The story itself is framed by censorship and containment. The 1928 federal raid on Innsmouth is recounted as an obscure, little-known event. Its records sealed, its official explanation ambiguous. This invokes real-world strategies of narrative control, the cover-up, the classified file, the silence of institutions. Readers are not merely observers, they are complicit investigators who, by reading, breach containment protocols. This rhetorical structure transforms the text into a kind of forbidden archive. We are not consuming fiction, we are uncovering it. It is not entertainment, it is violation. In this way, the narrative casts its own readership as cultic inheritors. Once the knowledge is accessed, the reader becomes part of the lineage it describes. And so, through a synthesis of ethnographic detail, architectural realism, intertextual anchoring, and rhetorical containment, Lovecraft achieves something rare. He makes myth behave like memory. The cults of Innsmouth are not merely created. They are reconstructed using the very tools we trust to verify truth. The effect is subtle, corrosive, and permanent. And now that we understand the machinery behind the myth, we can examine the deeper conceptual architecture it supports. For what does it mean, philosophically, thematically, existentially, to posit a world where our lineage does not lead upward but downward into scales, gills, and dreaming cities beneath the sea? That question begins our next journey into the nature and themes that animate the Innsmouth heresy. The Innsmouth mythos, like much of Lovecraft's work, is rooted not in conventional terror, but in philosophical vertigo. Its true horror arises not from creatures or rituals, but from concepts, ideas so corrosive to the human psyche that they threaten to erode meaning itself. Central among these are three interlocking principles: cosmic insignificance, biological entropy, and the instability of reality, particularly the porous boundary between waking life and dream. These are not merely literary devices, they are metaphysical weapons, ideas which, once entertained, reshape the thinker. In The Shadow over Innsmouth, these principles converge to dismantle not just the protagonist's sense of self, but the very foundation of human exceptionalism. This is not horror in the traditional sense. It is ontological sabotage. Cosmic insignificance forms the philosophical backbone of the entire Lovecraftian universe, but it achieves especially personal potency in Innsmouth. Here, the revelation is not that humanity is small in the face of the cosmos, but that you are. The protagonist discovers not a distant alien threat, but a secret within his own blood. The deep ones do not descend from the sky. They rise from the ancestral past. This inversion is critical. The horror is not external, it is internal and inherited. Consider the line near the story's end. I shall dwell with the others in that glorious city of Yahantlay, and in my dreams behold the wonders that are to come. This is not madness, but enlightenment twisted into its inverse. The realization is not of powerlessness, but of belonging to a power that renders human concerns irrelevant. We must pause here. Insignificance in the Innsmouth model is not imposed, it is realized. The horror lies in accepting that the self was never sovereign to begin with. Closely tied to this is the concept of biological entropy. Entropy, as a principle, suggests the gradual degradation of systems into disorder. Lovecraft, however, reimagines this not as decay, but as transformation. a return to an earlier, less differentiated state. The hybridization in Innsmouth is not degeneration, as many critics have mistakenly argued. It is convergence. The human form is not deteriorating, but reverting, shedding the illusion of separateness. The bulging eyes, the gill slits, the webbed fingers, these are not deformities, but ancestral recall. In this light, the cult's rituals and interbreeding are not blasphemies. They are acts of realignment. The deep ones are not mutations. They are originals. The townspeople are not corrupted. They are corrected. This reveals something profound. Lovecraft weaponizes evolution itself, turning it backward, making it not a ladder upward but a spiral downward into origin. In this cosmology, change does not equal progress. It equals remembrance. The dream state, an enduring motif across Lovecraft's work, takes on a special function in the Innsmouth narrative. It is not an escape, but a medium of transmission. Dreams reveal what waking consciousness suppresses. They are the communication line between hybrid mind and submerged ancestry. The protagonist's final acceptance of his nature occurs not through physical mutation, but through dream revelation. He remembers being someone else, or rather, something else. This destabilizes the Cartesian premise of the self. I think, therefore I am becomes suspect if dreams can implant truths the waking mind cannot withstand. Lovecraft was undoubtedly influenced here by both Freud's theory of the unconscious and Schopenhauer's idea of the world as dream. But unlike Freud, who believed the unconscious could be integrated, Lovecraft presents it as fundamentally alien. The dream does not express your hidden desires. It exposes your hidden ancestry. It is not you dreaming. It is something dreaming through you. The fusion of these three concepts, insignificance, entropy, and dream as reality, yields a fourth, more disturbing implication. Identity itself is a temporary construction. In the Innsmouth model, selfhood is a thin membrane stretched over vast pre-human continuities. The narrator's descent is not into madness, but into continuity. His horror is not that he is changing, but that he was never truly human to begin with. This recalls a Gnostic inversion of salvation. To awaken is to realize you were never who you thought you were. The Innsmouth bloodline operates like a dormant virus of identity, activated by proximity to its source. Once stirred, it erases autonomy, replacing the self with species memory. This is not symbolic, it is doctrinal. The cult's philosophy denies the premise of personal uniqueness. In its place, it installs hereditary communion. And once this realization occurs, no therapy, ideology, or reason can restore the illusion of individual self. Compare this to other works in the genre, and the distinction becomes clear. In Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, transformation is framed as moral conflict, good battling evil within. In Bram Stoker's Dracula, infection implies loss of soul and virtue. But in The Shadow over Innsmouth, transformation is neither moral nor tragic. It is ancestral. There is no fight. There is only discovery. The narrator ends not in resistance, but in longing to rejoin his kin beneath the waves. This removes the scaffolding of Western moral binaries. It is not sin that threatens man, but memory. It is not evil that lurks within, but origin. And so, the story functions as a philosophical parable, not about fear of the other, but about the horror of recognizing oneself as already othered by inheritance. To read Innsmouth through this lens is to confront the possibility that human identity is an evolutionary interlude, a brief structure between aquatic past and aquatic future. In this view, Lovecraft's deep ones are not invaders, but inevitabilities. They do not conquer, they reclaim. And in doing so, they reveal the deepest tenet of cosmic horror, that meaning, identity, and stability are not eternal truths, but local illusions. The sea, eternal and indifferent, washes them all away. The next wave will not ask permission, it will simply come. Having established the core philosophical framework behind the cult's worldview, we now descend into the beings themselves, the entities, deities, and biological intelligences that the people of Innsmouth worship, embody, and become. For what is a philosophy without the gods, or proto-gods, that express its logic in flesh, in myth, and in dreams that speak of the deep? If the philosophical framework of Innsmouth dismantles the illusion of selfhood and significance, then the entities it centers, Those beings worshipped, emulated, and eventually become, anchor that dissolution in mythic and biological form. These are not gods in any traditional sense. They are forces, vast, ancient, impersonal, and yet oddly familial. Lovecraft's beings defy theological expectations. They do not create, they do not judge, and they do not care. Yet they persist. And it is this persistence, this unrelenting presence across time, dream, and blood, that makes them worthy of cultic reverence. Among these, Father Dagon, Mother Hydra, and the Deep Ones themselves form a kind of blasphemous trinity, not creator, redeemer, and spirit, but progenitor, breeder, and inheritor. Father Dagon, despite his mythological ancestry, is here reconceived as something closer to a primordial patriarch. In the shadow over Innsmouth, he is neither fully named nor fully seen. Instead, his presence is inferred through ritual, statue, and whispered memory. He is the god of return, the original from whom all transformations descend. His size, hinted to be enormous, suggests not just physical magnitude but temporal immensity. He is not old, he is before. His name appears inscribed on temple walls and muttered by acolytes, but never uttered by the narrator himself. This silence is meaningful. It implies a taboo not just of speech, but of recognition. Dagon represents the moment of ancestral admission, the acknowledgement that what one becomes is what one always was. He is not worshipped for his power. He is worshipped because he exists, unchanging, unkillable, and always watching from beneath. Mother Hydra, often neglected in critical discussions, compliments Dagon as matriarch and incubator. While Dagon symbolizes origin, Hydra embodies gestation and proliferation. Her very name, borrowed from the mythic Greek beast of many regenerating heads, signals fertility twisted into excess. If Dagon is the memory of ancestry, Hydra is the biology of inheritance. She is said to dwell in the deepest trenches, surrounded by swarms of uncounted offspring. These are not metaphors. They are literal beings, offspring, spawn, descendants. Her worship reflects a monstrous maternalism. The cult reveres her not with fear, but with hunger, longing for her embrace as one longs for return to the womb. In this light, the sea is not death. It is gestation. The individual is not extinguished. It is reabsorbed. Hydra's mythos reinforces a key Lovecraftian reversal. Immortality is not a gift. It is an obligation. But it is the Deep Ones themselves who most disturb. Not because they are alien, but because they are familiar. Amphibious, humanoid, and functionally immortal, they live in vast underwater cities like Innsmouth, reproducing with humans in exchange for wealth and protection. Their appearance, bulging eyes, rubbery skin, gill-like structures, is unsettling, yet profoundly symbolic. They are what we become. Their existence challenges all binaries, human and inhuman, animal and god, past and future. They speak human languages and yet possess their own. They trade in gold but live outside time. Most chilling of all, they do not die. When they age, they return to the sea and shed their humanity like old skin. Their lives do not end. They transform. This reveals something critical. Death is not the end of the self. It is the end of the illusion of self. The Deep Ones prove that what lies beneath is not chaos, but continuity. Even more unsettling is their apparent morality, or rather, the lack of it. The Deep Ones are not evil, they are not good, they are indifferent. They make pacts, but not promises. They bestow gifts, strange gold, fish in abundance, but demand offspring in return. Their transactions are biological, not spiritual. This is not covenant, it is contract. The cults of Innsmouth understand this and comply. They intermarry, they worship, they protect the reef, not out of love nor fear, but from understanding. This is the price of continuity. The philosophical implication is chilling. Survival requires surrender. Evolution is not progress, but alignment with the dominant form. Resistance is not punished, it is rendered irrelevant. The Deep Ones do not coerce. They wait. Yet there are other forces suggested. Dream-born entities, cosmic intelligences that exist outside physical geography, but whose influence bleeds into the mythos. Innsmouth itself, the Deep One city, exists as much in dream as in ocean. Its name is remembered by those who have never visited it. Its architecture is glimpsed in sleep before it is seen in waking life. This implies a dual existence, material and honoric. Lovecraft often used the dreamlands as a parallel dimension, where the unconscious access deeper truths, and Yuhan Thle may be an outpost of that metaphysical realm. It is not simply a city. It is a memory of a city, implanted before birth, recalled in dreams, visited only after transformation. This suggests that the Deep Ones do not merely control the sea. They control access to reality itself. They are not limited by space. They are distributed through time, through inheritance, through dream. One must also consider the silent gods that linger behind Dagon and Hydra, beings like Cthulhu, whose influence, though not explicit in the Innsmouth narrative, casts long shadows. The cult's theology is not discrete, it is modular. Dagon and Hydra may be subordinate avatars, regional deities in a vast cosmic pantheon. The Deep Ones might serve multiple masters, or none. Lovecraft's mythos resists hierarchical structure. It is not a pyramid, it is an archipelago, connected by theme, not creed. Each cult is a node, each god a tide, and through them we glimpse not order but density. A thick, sedimented universe where belief is sediment and horror is merely what happens when that sediment is disturbed. Thus, the entities of the Innsmouth cult are not monsters in the classic sense. They are metaphysical expressions of continuity, of ancestral return, of species humility. They embody a world in which the individual is an illusion, the self is porous, and time flows backwards as easily as forward. They are not here to destroy. They are here to complete the cycle. What they offer is not apocalypse, but permanence. And now that we have glimpsed the beings themselves, we must examine the consequences of encountering them, not merely in body, but in mind. In the next section, we turn to humanity's role in this system, the madness that results from contact, the cultic structures that contain it, and the epistemic collapse that awaits those who learn too much. The true terror of Innsmouth is not the presence of monsters, but the slow realization that humanity has already welcomed them, that it has done so willingly over generations, and without fully grasping what it was becoming. In Lovecraft's universe, human interaction with the cosmic or the alien does not result in enlightenment or moral awakening. It results in madness. But madness in this context is not clinical nor even metaphorical, it is epistemological. It is what happens when the mind touches something it was never designed to understand. The people of Innsmouth, unlike victims in traditional horror narratives, are not simply corrupted by outside forces. They are participants in a long-standing hereditary contract. And that complicity is what renders their condition so horrifying, and their sanity so fragile. Consider this carefully. The madness associated with Innsmouth is not a breakdown of reason, but a consequence of its extension. At the core of this madness is the terrifying shift in identity that comes from the discovery of ancestry. The unnamed narrator of The Shadow over Innsmouth begins his journey with curiosity, moves through disgust, and ends in exultation. Not because he has been deceived, but because he has finally recognized the truth of his lineage. I found myself chanting the formulae I had learned, he writes, and enjoying a mental picture of the deep sea floor with its garden of coral and pearl. This progression is not descent into insanity, but a reorientation of what counts as reality. The horror is not that he becomes something else. The horror is that he was never who he thought he was. His mind does not collapse under pressure, it adapts. In this inversion, madness becomes revelation, and sanity becomes delusion, a fragile mask hiding the abyss of blood memory. The townspeople of Innsmouth exemplify another facet of this process: communal, distributed madness. Unlike isolated lunacy, which isolates and disorients the individual, cultic madness creates structure. It builds continuity. It offers shared rituals, encoded speech, generational purpose. This is not incoherence, it is alternative coherence. The esoteric order of Dagon functions as a stabilizing system. It translates the unspeakable into practice, absorbs psychological dissonance into tradition, and redistributes fear as piety. In a strange way, it civilizes horror, the same rites that would fracture an outsider's mind, provide internal peace to initiates. This dynamic draws unsettling parallels to historical cults, mystery religions, and even modern ideological systems that organize identity around exclusionary myth. It is not the reality of the belief that sustains it. It is its utility in containing madness by encoding it. We must pause to observe how Lovecraft manipulates this tension between sanity and structure. The U.S. government raid on Innsmouth, presented as a sanitizing act of rational intervention, only deepens the ambiguity. Official narratives declare the town cleansed, the threat eliminated. But the narrator's own trajectory contradicts this. His transformation occurs after the purge, in secret, unacknowledged by any authority. This reveals something unsettling. The institutions of order can remove symptoms, but not the cause. The deep ones do not resist extermination because they do not fear it. They outlast it, and so does the knowledge they impart. This suggests that madness is not merely a response to horror, but a vector for its continuation. The more one tries to suppress it, the more it embeds itself in the psyche and the bloodline. Rationality here is not a cure. It is an invitation to deeper infection. There is also a linguistic dimension to the madness function, one that mirrors the structural decay of meaning. As the narrator explores Innsmouth, his language becomes fragmented. He begins with detailed, almost clinical descriptions of the town's decay. But as his perceptions deepen, his narrative shifts. He uses more adjectives, more uncertainty, more dreamlike imagery. I thought I saw shapes. I cannot be sure. It must have been. These are phrases of epistemic unraveling. This style change is not aesthetic. It is symptomatic. It mirrors the effect of forbidden knowledge on cognition. The horror of Innsmouth is not simply what is seen, but what it does to the grammar of perception. Once a word like Yihan Thle enters the mind, it displaces familiar structures. Meaning begins to erode. The result is not chaos, but a new syntax, one designed not to express reality, but to obscure its boundaries. In the wider mythos, this same function recurs, whether it is the revelation of forbidden texts, the Necronomicon, the sight of non-Euclidean geometries, the call of Cthulhu, or the incursion of dreams, the dream quest of unknown Kadath. Lovecraft consistently depicts madness not as a loss of mental faculties, but as an adjustment to a broader frame of reference. This is why the madness of Innsmouth is so distinctive. It is not loud, not dramatic, not overtly violent. It is patient. It creeps through generations, spoken in half-whispers, written in family Bibles, traced in the contours of the face. And by the time it becomes visible, it is already too late. The madness has matured into belief, and belief into transformation. The ultimate irony of Innsmouth is that madness is the only sane response to a world where bloodline determines fate, where gods do not offer salvation, but invitation, and where the deepest truths come not from books or visions, but from dreams one did not choose to dream. To encounter the cult is to encounter an alternative anthropology, one in which madness is not dysfunction, but function repurposed. One either joins the order or denies it and withers in its wake. The mind bends or it breaks. Either way, it is marked. In the next and final section of this part, we examine what makes this process so irreversible, the nature of forbidden knowledge itself, and the epistemic collapse that comes not just from what is learned, but from the very act of knowing. In the Innsmouth mythos, knowledge is not merely dangerous, it is catalytic. It does not empower the seeker, but dissolves them. What begins as curiosity becomes dissolution. What masquerades as discovery ends in irrevocable transformation. Unlike traditional horror, where forbidden knowledge leads to divine punishment or moral ruin, Lovecraft presents a graver consequence: epistemic collapse. To know too much is not to err, it is to cease being knowable to oneself. And nowhere is this process more intimately explored than in The Shadow over Innsmouth, where knowledge operates not as illumination, but as infection, spreading through thought, language, memory, and blood. We must begin with the narrator's investigation, which superficially resembles rational inquiry. He travels, interviews locals, cross-references stories, and attempts to contextualize the myth of Innsmouth through the lens of objective observation. This procedural structure mimics Enlightenment epistemology, truth gained through method, deduction, evidence. But as his research advances, his certainty declines. Each answer fragments the frame through which reality had previously been understood. The more he learns, the less he comprehends. Not because the facts are incoherent, but because they no longer belong to the system he is using to interpret them. This reveals something profound. Forbidden knowledge is not dangerous because it contradicts known truths, but because it renders the framework of truth irrelevant. The turning point comes when knowledge is no longer external. As the narrator discovers his own Innsmouth ancestry, information becomes identity. I was a part of this, he realizes. I had been all along. This is not revelation. It is epistemic annihilation. The subject is no longer an observer, but the observed. The data has become the self. This mirrors the concept of autoethnography in anthropological critique, when the line between researcher and subject collapses. But in Lovecraft's narrative, that collapse is biological. The narrator is not merely studying a cult, he is its descendant. This convergence of inquiry and inheritance shatters the illusion of objectivity. He cannot step back. There is no outside. Knowledge has no edge. It envelops. And once enveloped, the self must either dissolve or align. Consider the cult's secrecy in this light. Their silence is not just protection, it is containment. The rituals, symbols, and bloodlines are guarded not because they are malevolent, but because they are volatile. To speak of Yahainthle, to describe the rites of Dagon, is to risk contaminating the listener with meaning they cannot metabolize. The U.S. government's raid in 1928, though framed as a rational intervention, is revealed to be an act of desperate suppression. Their removal of texts, destruction of temples, and internment of residents is not unlike a quarantine. But, as history shows, containment fails when the vector is conceptual. The real danger is not the physical cult, but the idea of it, the myth that, once spoken, breeds in the dark corners of the mind. What the government sought to erase, the narrator perpetuates simply by telling the story. The deep ones themselves represent a kind of biological heresy against knowledge as stability. Their existence suggests not simply an unknown species, but an unknown mode of being. They do not age in a linear fashion. They do not die. Their consciousness appears to exist across generations, perhaps even across dimensions. What can human epistemology do with such facts? Biology collapses into myth, memory becomes prophecy, and language begins to behave like dream. The narrator's dreams, increasingly vivid and aquatic, are not symbolic. They are transmissions. His thoughts are not his own. They are recollections. This collapse of epistemic sovereignty, the idea that one's mind is a closed, independent space, is the most insidious revelation of all. It suggests that thought itself can be hereditary, that identity is not constructed, but recalled. Compare this to older myths of forbidden knowledge: Prometheus stealing fire, Faust trading his soul for learning, Adam and Eve biting the fruit. In each, knowledge is punished because it elevates man too far. In Innsmouth, knowledge is not punished, it is fulfilled. The horror is not hubris, but accuracy. The cult does not mislead, it reveals. And what it reveals is that humanity is not separate from the monstrous, but continuous with it. The deep ones do not lie, they clarify. It is the world that has been dishonest, building epistemologies on sand and naming them civilization. Once this scaffolding is removed, madness is not a breakdown. It is a recalibration to truths the old system could not hold. This epistemic collapse extends beyond the individual. As the myth of Innsmouth enters culture, as readers, scholars, and audiences engage with it, they too risk infection. Lovecraft understood this and built it into the structure of the tale. The story is told retrospectively as a kind of confession, with suppressed details and redacted names. It reads like a leaked document. The reader becomes the next investigator. And with each detail absorbed, the myth thickens. This is how forbidden knowledge replicates, not through dissemination, but repetition. The more we study it, the more it studies us. The deep ones do not need to speak. We speak for them. And so, forbidden knowledge in Innsmouth is not about facts hidden in old books. It is knowledge that cannot be possessed without being transformed. Once accessed, it alters the epistemic frame. Once spoken, it alters language. Once remembered, it alters the self. It is not knowledge about something. It is knowledge as something. In this way, The cults of Innsmouth are not keepers of secrets. They are carriers of epistemic infection. And now that we understand the ideas they embody, the entities they worship, and the madness they normalize, we must turn our attention to where all myths take root, in story. For the truth of Innsmouth is most enduring not in philosophy, but in narrative. In Part 3, we return to the literary texts themselves to trace how this myth manifested, mutated, and endured through fiction that reads like confession and lore that reads like history. The lineage of the Innsmouth mythos does not begin with The Shadow over Innsmouth, 1931, alone. Rather, it emerges from a slow evolution of motifs, linguistic, thematic, and philosophical, that appear throughout Lovecraft's earlier works. In tracing these origins, one uncovers a fascinating process of mythic sedimentation, wherein each tale deposits a layer of imagery and idea that would later coalesce into the fully realized theology of Dagon and the Deep Ones. It is not a singular invention, but an accretion, a narrative reef built across decades. Consider this carefully. The cults of Innsmouth were not born whole. They evolved step by step, as Lovecraft's imagination drifted from cosmic abstraction to biological intimacy, from the infinite gulfs of space to the dark, pressurized depths of the human body. The first articulation of this descent appears in Lovecraft's early short story, Dagon, 1919. Written shortly after World War I, it functions as the seed from which Innsmouth would eventually grow. The narrator, an isolated, shell-shocked sailor, escapes captivity only to find himself adrift in a sea transformed by nightmare. He encounters a monolith rising from the depths, engraved with delineations of fish and aquatic life forms of a wholly unknown nature. What terrifies him is not merely the grotesque sculpture, but its implication, that these images depict living things which still inhabit the abyss. When one of them surfaces, a vast, scaled entity with glistening arms, the sailor's sanity collapses. Yet, this is no ordinary monster story. The sea in Dagon is not an alien realm. It is a memory of the Earth's own beginning. The sailor does not discover the unknown. He rediscovers the forgotten. It is an embryonic version of what will later become the Innsmouth revelation, that humanity is not distinct from the oceanic other, but descended from it. In The Temple, 1920, Lovecraft continues this aquatic preoccupation, blending wartime realism with visionary descent. A German U-boat commander narrates the gradual breakdown of his vessel and his mind after discovering an ancient statue dredged from the sea. The crew's ensuing madness, suicides, and the eventual isolation of the narrator mirror the moral and metaphysical claustrophobia of the shadow over Innsmouth. At the story's end, the commander descends into the ocean itself, where he beholds the ruins of a sunken city of unimaginable antiquity. He accepts this descent willingly, even reverently, writing, "It is now my fate to die among the wonders of the deep." The language anticipates the later Innsmouth narrator's own acceptance of his hybrid destiny. The Temple thus introduces a crucial motif, that madness and revelation are not opposites, but convergent. The sea becomes the ultimate archive, preserving not only lost civilizations, but the origin of belief itself. This evolution reaches a critical midpoint in The Call of Cthulhu, 1926, where Lovecraft first perfects his structure of mythic documentation, the layering of testimonies, fragments, and pseudo-scholarly apparatus. Though Cthulhu himself belongs to the cosmic rather than the marine pantheon, the text's framing devices anticipate the ethnographic realism of The Shadow over Innsmouth. The Louisiana cult of Cthulhu, with its blasphemous fish frogs of the nameless design, serves as a thematic prototype for the esoteric order of Dagon. Its rituals, centered on interspecies worship and ecstatic trance, prefigure the Innsmouth ceremonies. What unites them is the equation of religion with inheritance, belief not as faith, but as lineage. The Cthulhu cultists chant of their god's return when the stars are right, just as the Deep Ones promise a time when men shall descend beneath the waves and dwell forever in glory. The two are not separate mythologies, but different expressions of the same cosmic continuum, space and sea as parallel infinities, each populated by beings that render human meaning irrelevant. The connective tissue between these stories lies in Lovecraft's shifting depiction of the sea. In early works, it is an external wilderness, vast, indifferent, uncharted. By the 1930s, it becomes internalized, the landscape of heredity and dream. This transition marks the maturation of Lovecraft's philosophy from fear of the unknown to fear of recognition. The Deep Ones are not aliens, they are ancestors. Their abyss is not distant but imminent, echoing Freud's unheimlich, the uncanny return of what was once familiar. The narrator of Innsmouth does not confront an invader, but an inheritance. In that sense, the Innsmouth cults represent the culmination of a long process through which Lovecraft collapsed the external cosmos into the human bloodstream. What had once been astronomical became genealogical. Intertextual connections reinforce this pattern of collapse. In The Dunwich Horror, 1928, Lovecraft explores another cursed lineage, the Whateleys, whose monstrous hybrid offspring is the result of communion with those from beyond. While the setting shifts from sea to hill, the logic remains the same. Knowledge of ancestry leads to revelation and destruction. The difference lies in the response. In Dunwich, the community unites to destroy the hybrid. In Innsmouth, the community itself is the hybrid. The horror has gone from being an external threat to a cultural norm. The sea, once barrier, becomes sanctuary. This inversion is crucial. It transforms Lovecraft's earlier dichotomy of civilization versus chaos into a continuum where the monstrous is not eradicated but absorbed. Finally, one cannot overlook the self-referential architecture of Lovecraft's mythos, the deliberate cross-referencing of locations, books, and deities that lends an eerie authenticity to his fictional world. Innsmouth's geography is linked to Arkham, Kingsport, and Dunwich, forming a map of haunted continuity. Characters mention the Necronomicon, the same forbidden text cited in earlier tales. Even the federal raid on Innsmouth echoes the scientific and governmental institutions that repeatedly appear in Lovecraft's fiction, suggesting a long-running dialogue between myth and modernity. Each reference anchors the unreal in the real, making disbelief not merely difficult, but unnatural. The reader's mind, like the narrator's, becomes part of the system it seeks to study. Thus, the early manifestations of the Innsmouth mythos reveal Lovecraft's gradual mastery of a unique narrative formula. The merging of history with heresy, realism with revelation. What began as isolated maritime horror evolved into a philosophical network, an ecosystem of stories connected by theme, geography, and epistemology. The Deep Ones, the Whateleys, the Cthulhu cultists, all are branches of the same lineage, expressions of a cosmos that remembers more than humanity dares to know. And with these early foundations laid, Lovecraft would finally converge his scattered symbols into a single, devastating revelation, the story that bears Innsmouth's name, where myth and blood become one. Of all Lovecraft's stories, The Shadow over Innsmouth, written in 1931, published in 1936, stands as the definitive articulation of the Innsmouth mythos, a tale where personal revelation merges with regional decay, and horror unfolds not through confrontation with the unknown, but through the slow unearthing of the all-too-familiar. It is not merely a story about discovering a cult, it is about discovering one's place within that cult. The narrative is structured not as a tragedy, but as a delayed inheritance, a recognition of biological destiny masked as ethnographic travelogue. If Lovecraft's earlier works hinted at submerged ancestry and cosmic affiliation, this story confirms it, embodying all his core themes: epistemic collapse, hereditary horror, mythic realism, in a single, spiraling descent. The story begins with the illusion of investigation. The narrator, unnamed but educated and skeptical, travels to the decaying Massachusetts town of Innsmouth to satisfy a vague antiquarian curiosity. The opening tone is rational, almost clinical. It would be difficult to explain exactly why I chose to visit Innsmouth. He frames his trip as an exercise in regional history, not self-exploration. This structural sleight of hand is critical. Lovecraft lulls the reader into a false sense of anthropological distance. This is, after all, just another strange town, another dying place on the map. But, from the first description, Innsmouth is marked not just by economic decline, but by physical deviance. People with strange, narrow heads, flat noses, bulgy, starry eyes and queer, elongated ears. The town itself speaks in phenotype. Its buildings sag, its streets feel empty of time. It is not a ghost town, it is a gestating one. The esoteric order of Dagon, Innsmouth's central cult, is introduced with typical Lovecraftian obliqueness. Its rituals are never directly described, only hinted at by terrified locals and half-sane outcasts. The cult's headquarters is an old Masonic hall, a detail Lovecraft includes to subtly invoke continuity between respectable fraternal orders and hidden religious ecstasies. Through the drunkard Zadok Allen, Lovecraft delivers the tale's great expository monologue, The History of Captain Obed Marsh, who brought the Deep One pact back from the South Seas. "They brung up gold and plenty of fish," Zadok whispers, "and they was some monstrous kind of critters from the sea." In this moment, myth and trade merge, prosperity bought not with labor, but with blood. This is not merely a Faustian bargain, it is a colonial one. Marsh imports a foreign cult, interbreeds his descendants with its priests, and transforms his town into an outpost of hybrid theology. Consider this carefully. Lovecraft is not describing invasion. He is describing adaptation. The narrator's transformation mirrors that of the town itself. At first, he is repulsed by the people, the architecture, the air. He becomes a classic Lovecraft protagonist, the skeptical outsider drawn into horror through intellectual curiosity. His flight from the town, pursued through moonlit streets by amphibious hybrids, is one of Lovecraft's most suspenseful sequences. But the story does not end with escape. Instead, it continues into a second, quieter phase, where horror is internalized. In Boston, the narrator begins to research his genealogy. He uncovers documents, he traces names, he dreams of underwater cities. And finally, in the story's devastating final paragraphs, he realizes that the blood of Innsmouth runs through his veins. "I myself am the key to the forbidden gate." This sentence functions as both revelation and submission. He does not resist. He yearns to return, to transform, to remember. This ending marks a radical departure from earlier horror conventions. There is no exorcism, no destruction of evil, no salvific closure. Instead, the narrator embraces his fate. He plans to return to the sea. He speaks of great temples beneath the waves, and the joy of dwelling in Yahantlé with his kin. The horror has become heritage. This narrative inversion, where fear becomes desire, embodies Lovecraft's philosophical core. The truth is not merely disturbing, it is transformative. One does not learn it and remain unchanged. One learns it and becomes it. In this structure, the traditional Gothic resolution is impossible. Knowledge is not a threshold to be crossed. It is a current that carries the self away. The narrative also functions as a meditation on bloodline and cultural secrecy. The story is saturated with references to heredity, the narrator's family tree, the Innsmouth look, the interbreeding with deep ones. Identity is framed not as an act of will, but as an unfolding of latent lineage. The story's terror lies not in what one might become, but in the realization that one already is. This motif resonates with broader cultural anxieties of the 1930s, eugenics, racial purity, national decline, yet Lovecraft transmutes these into mythic allegory. The Innsmouth bloodline is not a moral failing, it is a metaphysical truth. One cannot choose to be human, one can only discover that one never was. Moreover, the story's realism, its references to real towns, its pseudo-official framing, enhances its effect. Lovecraft ends the tale by mentioning the 1928 government raid, implying that the narrator's account is part of a larger, suppressed history. The federal authorities destroy the reef, close the port, intern the people. But the bloodline remains. The narrator is not arrested. He is ignored. Knowledge persists in silence, not exposure. This creates a chilling postscript. The story is not finished. It is ongoing, and the reader, by hearing it, becomes implicated in its continuity. In The Shadow over Innsmouth, Lovecraft perfects his narrative architecture. Myth disguised as memoir, horror disguised as heritage, madness disguised as memory. It is not just a tale of transformation, it is a tale of recognition. And in that recognition, we glimpse the full horror of the Innsmouth cults, not as aberrations, but as revelations. The deep ones do not come for us. They wait, in blood, in dreams, in family names. And when the time comes, we do not resist them. We return to them. Before the shadow over Innsmouth formalized Lovecraft's vision of maritime descent, the seeds of that mythology were already germinating in two key stories, Dagon, 1919, and The Temple, 1920. Together, these early works form the embryonic strata of the Innsmouth mythos, revealing the first outlines of Lovecraft's fascination with aquatic ancestry, psychological collapse, and the paradoxical lure of the abyss. They are, in essence, the myth's pre-human fossils, rough, uneven, but carrying within them the DNA of everything that would come later. The deep ones have not yet been named. Yahantle has not yet been imagined, but the sea already pulses with an ancient, remembering intelligence. In these stories, we see the moment when Lovecraft's cosmic horror turns inward, when the ocean ceases to be mere setting and becomes a sentient theology. Dagon opens not with cosmic scale, but with personal confession. The narrator, a morphine-addicted war survivor, recounts a hideous experience that destroyed his sanity. Adrift at sea, he witnesses a cataclysmic upheaval. The ocean floor rises, exposing a black plain of slime and decay, littered with the corpses of ancient sea creatures. The description is not merely environmental, it is evolutionary regression. The whole bottom of the sea appeared to have been thrown upward by some mighty subterranean disturbance. He writes, "The region was one of cyclopean stone blocks covered with hieroglyphs of unknown origin." Here, Lovecraft fuses geology with scripture, turning the seafloor into a kind of drowned Bible. When the narrator encounters the titular creature, an immense piscine humanoid ascending from the depths, he faints, overwhelmed not by terror alone, but by recognition. "God, that hand, the window!" he screams, echoing the half-conscious awareness that what he has seen is not alien, but ancestral. The horror of Dagon is not that monsters exist, it is that they precede us. The story's brevity conceals its philosophical density. Lovecraft, writing just after the trauma of World War I, channels both the personal disintegration of the soldier and the collective dissolution of Western certainties. The sea becomes the war's unconscious, boundless, immoral, filled with corpses and forgotten empires. The narrator's morphine addiction, far from incidental, functions as a metaphor for epistemic collapse. Each dose is an act of willful forgetting, a denial of what the ocean revealed. Yet his confession betrays a paradox. He cannot stop remembering. "I dream of the creature of the abyss," he admits, "and I know that it waits for me." This is the first articulation of a theme that will recur in the shadow over Innsmouth. That revelation is irreversible, and that knowledge, once acquired, reshapes the self until only transformation or death remain. The morphine, like the federal raid of Innsmouth, merely delays the inevitable. The Temple develops these ideas with greater structural sophistication, blending Lovecraft's fascination with empirical observation and spiritual ruin. Set aboard a German U-boat during World War I, it is narrated through the captain's journal, a format that mimics the scientific detachment of log-keeping, only to subvert it as reason decays into obsession. The captain's discovery of an ivory head, an artifact of non-human origin, marks the intrusion of the mythic into the mechanical. Slowly, his crew succumbs to madness and suicide, while the captain clings to protocol, recording his descent with chilling calm. "I have commanded my own submarine," he writes, "but I feel now that I am being guided by unseen forces to an unknown destination. That destination, as it turns out, is the seafloor itself, where the U-boat comes to rest before the gates of a sunken city." Lovecraft's description is breathtakingly architectural. There lay revealed in the waning light a city of marble, covered with seaweed and the marks of time, yet perfect in design, serene and eternal. It is Yahantle in embryo, a city that predates history, preserved in pressure and silence. The power of the Temple lies in its paradoxical tone. The captain's voice remains rational, even as his mind and environment collapse. This dissonance, the persistence of reason amidst dissolution, anticipates Lovecraft's later depictions of madness as lucidity misapplied. His final act is not suicide, but surrender. "I am going down through the temple door, into the eternal light which has called me." Unlike the sailor of Dagon, who flees the sea in terror, the captain embraces it. His descent is spiritual, not tragic. The sea, here, is not death. It is fulfillment. The narrative structure thus mirrors the theological journey of the Innsmouth narrator. Initial horror yields to recognition, then to devotion. In both, the final movement is toward belonging. When examined together, these two stories reveal Lovecraft's developing mastery over the language of descent. Dagon is revelation through shock, the encounter with the prehistoric that annihilates the present. The Temple is revelation through submission, the acceptance of the prehistoric as destiny. Between them, Lovecraft experiments with perspective, temporality, and theology. Both narrators write in the past tense, as if already dead, suggesting that the act of narration itself is posthumous, a final record before absorption. This temporal dislocation becomes a defining feature of the shadow over Innsmouth, in which the narrator speaks from the liminal space between human and deep one, sanity and transformation. What we witness in these early tales is not simply the birth of a myth, but the crystallization of a worldview. That descent, not ascent, is the true form of revelation. Intertextually, these stories also serve as connective tissue between Lovecraft's mythos and broader literary traditions. The sea imagery evokes Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner, while the descent motif echoes Dante's Inferno. Yet, Lovecraft subverts both. There is no redemption, no moral order, no return to grace. His mariners do not emerge purified. They disappear, absorbed into the medium they once sought to master. This inversion transforms maritime exploration, a symbol of Enlightenment curiosity, into a metaphor for epistemological suicide. The pursuit of knowledge does not elevate, it submerges. The ocean is no longer frontier but origin, the place where knowledge folds back into matter. Thus, Dagon and the Temple stand as Lovecraft's first articulations of what might be called the Innsmouth principle, that the deepest horror lies not in discovering monsters, but in discovering that we are their continuation. In these tales, water is not chaos, it is memory. The sea does not conceal secrets, it is the secret, an ever-present reminder that the line between humanity and its ancestors is not a barrier, but a tide. And once that tide turns, it does not retreat. It waits, patient and eternal, for every seeker who dares to look too long into the deep. While Lovecraft's original tales laid the foundations of the Innsmouth mythos, its evolution did not end with him. The world he created, especially its vision of hybrid descent, oceanic gods, and forbidden cults, proved too fertile to remain confined to a single author. After Lovecraft's death in 1937, his legacy was taken up by a loose circle of writers, correspondents, and imitators, many of whom expanded, reinterpreted, or systematized his creations. Chief among them was August Derleth, who became both the mythos's executor and, arguably, its first revisionist. What followed was a transformation of the Innsmouth narrative from esoteric horror into a broader, and at times distorted, mythological framework. Consider this carefully. What Lovecraft left open-ended and ambiguous, his successors often tried to explain, and in doing so, shifted the metaphysical tenor of the deep ones from symbolic unknowability to codified cosmology. August Derleth's contributions to the mythos are both substantial and controversial. As co-founder of Arkham House, he was instrumental in preserving and promoting Lovecraft's work, ensuring that stories like The Shadow over Innsmouth reached wider audiences. Yet, in his own fiction, Derleth imposed a moral dualism fundamentally alien to Lovecraft's worldview. He recast the mythos into a struggle between elder gods, benevolent, and great old ones, malevolent, framing entities like Dagon and Cthulhu as evil beings eventually thwarted by higher cosmic forces. In stories like The Lurker at the Threshold, 1945, Derleth references Dagon and Innsmouth directly, but positions them within a universe that has structure, justice, and teleological closure. This represents a significant departure, where Lovecraft presented the cosmos as indifferent and impersonal, where knowledge led to collapse and transformation. Derleth's model reassures the reader that evil can be named, resisted, and even defeated. In effect, he converts metaphysical horror into mythic fantasy. Yet not all post-Lovecraftian writers followed Derleth's lead. Some sought to return to, or deepen, the ambiguity and existential dread of the original stories. Ramsay Campbell, writing from Britain, relocated Innsmouthian themes to the English coast, infusing stories like The Inhabitant of the Lake, 1964, with a similar atmosphere of regional decay and aquatic infection. In his work, cults remain secretive, hereditary, and biologically entangled with alien forces. Campbell's entities do not function within moral binaries. They erode reality in much the same way Lovecraft's did. Similarly, T.E.D. Klein's Black Man with a Horn, 1980, reimagines the Deep One's logic through the lens of cultural anthropology, suggesting that their influence might persist globally, diffused through forgotten rituals and diaspora mythologies. These writers reassert Lovecraft's core themes: the instability of identity, the dangers of inquiry, and the intimacy of monstrosity. The mythos would find another vein of expansion in Caitlin R. Kiernan, whose work brings psychological depth and gendered subtext to Lovecraftian motifs. Stories like Houses Under the Sea and The Drowning Girl engage with the idea of Innsmouthian heritage not simply as biological inevitability, but as metaphor for dissociation, mental illness, and liminal identity. Kiernan's characters often navigate watery dreams, ambiguous transformations, and a sense of being called, echoing the narrator of The Shadow over Innsmouth, but with added complexity around autonomy, trauma, and sexuality. This shift reflects a broader trend. Later, authors repurpose the mythos to explore internal fragmentation rather than external doom. The Deep Ones become symbols not only of lost ancestry, but of submerged selves. The sea is not just the past, it is the unconscious, the body, the repressed. In visual media and gaming, the cults of Innsmouth have also mutated. The 2001 film Dagon, directed by Stuart Gordon, loosely adapts The Shadow over Innsmouth, while blending it with the earlier Dagon tale. It replaces New England with a decaying Spanish fishing village, Imboca, but retains key elements: the amphibious hybrids, the sacrificial cult, and the revelation of hereditary monstrosity. Yet the film indulges in visual grotesquerie and explicit horror, reducing the mythos to spectacle. It shows what Lovecraft only suggested. This is not inherently a flaw, but it underscores a crucial point. Later interpretations often shift the mode from suggestion to depiction, from dread to exposure. The original story's power, its ability to make the reader complicit in imagining horror, fades when every secret is lit on screen. In role-playing games such as Call of Cthulhu, Chaosium 1981 present, Innsmouth features heavily as a site of investigation and danger. The Deep Ones become antagonists, the Order of Dagon, a cult to be disrupted. These mechanics recast the mythos into detective fiction, where knowledge can be weaponized and cults defeated. Yet, even here, the best campaigns retain Lovecraft's original ethos, that the more you learn, the more you unravel. Players who delve too deeply into Innsmouth lore often find their characters irreparably changed, not killed, but transformed, spiritually or biologically. The mythos becomes not an obstacle, but a mirror, reflecting the player's curiosity back at them as curse. Perhaps the most intriguing evolution of the Innsmouth motif lies in its quiet infiltration of modern identity. Discourse. Online subcultures, Lovecraftian forums, memes, even niche fashion have reimagined the Innsmouth look as a badge of outsiderhood, a metaphor for neurodivergence, queerness, or post-human identity. We all come from the sea, reads one popular reinterpretation. Some of us just remember better. This shift reclaims the Deep Ones not as threats, but as kin, estranged ancestors whose return marks not horror, but recognition. This is not Lovecraft's original intent, but it is a powerful continuation of the myth's central insight, that identity is unstable, and that the border between human and inhuman is not a line, but a tide. What we see then is not a single myth, but a proliferation. An aquatic rhizome branching outward, adapting to each medium and moment. From Derleth's dualistic theology to Kiernan's psychological ambiguity, from Campbell's coastal rot to online reclamations of fish blood pride, the Innsmouth cults continue to thrive in fiction, culture, and metaphor. And perhaps this is their truest form, not as a fixed theology, but as a living current, adapting across generations, genres, and geographies. The myth persists because it evolves, and the sea, as always, waits. The strange endurance of the Innsmouth myth is not limited to literary circles or horror subcultures. It has seeped with almost biological persistence into the realm of urban legend. Unlike many fictional towns, Innsmouth is consistently mistaken for, or intentionally conflated with, real coastal locations in New England. Despite Lovecraft's explicit framing of the town as fictional, and despite his maps placing it between known locales like Newburyport and Rowley, there remain those who insist, even today, that something like Innsmouth once existed. In forums, videos, and whispered retellings, Innsmouth is no longer just a symbol. It becomes a cryptic history, an event erased from public record, a town vanished by federal design. Consider this carefully. The effectiveness of the myth is not simply that it was well written, but that it was written as though it had always been true. In the decades following the publication of The Shadow over Innsmouth, scattered rumors began to surface in paranormal communities. In the 1960s and 70s, during a wave of interest in suppressed histories and government conspiracies, Innsmouth became absorbed into broader narratives about secret American occultism. Writers such as John Keel, best known for the Mothman prophecies, referenced fish-worshipping cults in Massachusetts that bore a suspicious resemblance to Lovecraft's creation, sometimes as metaphor, sometimes as rumor. Hoaxes followed. Fabricated newspaper clippings appeared online in the early 2000s claiming to report on the 1928 raid referenced in the story. One image, widely circulated before being debunked, showed a photograph of uniformed men standing before a shallow reef marked with unusual coral growths. While these forgeries were crude, they nonetheless reveal a curious cultural truth. People wanted Innsmouth to be real, not just as a cautionary tale, but as something hidden just beneath the surface of the known world. The geographical ambiguity of Lovecraft's New England, his blending of real and fictional towns, has only deepened this confusion. Marblehead, Massachusetts, which inspired much of Innsmouth's architecture, has often been misidentified as its real-world counterpart. Local legends and fishing towns across the northeastern seaboard now include vague whispers of families with strange faces, sightings of humanoid figures along misty harbors, and inexplicable disappearances near rocky outcroppings. These tales are not presented as Lovecraftian tributes. They are presented as local lore. Some come from tourists. Others are preserved in old mariner tales recounted in regional ghost story collections. What's notable is not their credibility, but their familiarity. The motifs, salt-stained books, shuttered churches, gold and jewelry carved with non-human symbols, are all lifted from Lovecraft. Yet, they reappear in contexts where his name is never mentioned. It is as though the myth, like the deep ones themselves, has bred in secret. One particularly persistent rumor involves Devil Reef, the ominous stone formation offshore in the shadow over Innsmouth. Though entirely fictional, the name has become attached to various jagged outcroppings along the New England coast. In Reddit threads, YouTube explorations, and amateur documentaries, Devil's Reef is spoken of as a cursed site, somewhere naval records refuse to chart, or where compasses behave erratically. These accounts often reference strange tides, lights under the water, or even singing heard through fog. While such anecdotes are anecdotal at best, their consistency over time suggests more than mere coincidence. What's at work here is a cultural feedback loop. Fiction generates folklore, which in turn is mistaken for fact. The boundaries dissolve, and in that liminality, the myth thrives. DNA ancestry culture has added a new dimension to this modern folklore. With the rise of home genetic testing, some users joke, or half believe, that their ambiguous results signal Innsmouthian lineage. On platforms like TikTok and Twitter, individuals reference having the Innsmouth look when describing facial features they consider unusual or hereditary. Posts with hashtags like Fish People or Ja Innsmouth Blood ironically embrace the idea of mutation as identity. The joke, of course, is half serious. These acts of digital folklore replicate the central theme of the shadow over Innsmouth. That one's ancestry may contain more than one can easily accept. The terrifying idea that identity is inherited, not chosen, finds new resonance in the era of genetic databases. To discover unexpected ancestry is, in some ways, to reenact Lovecraft's narrative. Except now, the archive is biological rather than literary. Even outside digital spaces, the myth has found eerie traction in fringe communities. Neo-pagan groups occasionally reference Dagon in rituals, sometimes in complete sincerity, sometimes as Lovecraftian pastiche. There are esoteric websites that claim to possess ancient marine grimoires, supposedly unearthed from drowned libraries or channeled from dream beings. These texts often bear an uncanny resemblance to Lovecraft's fictional creations, like the Pennacotic manuscripts or the esoteric Order of Dagon's Rites. But when confronted, their creators rarely admit to the literary source. Instead, they insist, often with unnerving calm, that the texts are older than fiction, that Lovecraft merely tapped into something already waiting. Here again, the distinction between hoax and belief collapses. The myth has become its own justification. What is it about the Innsmouth cults that invites this kind of imaginative participation, this transformation into folklore? Perhaps it is the myth's modular structure. Small town, strange rituals, hidden ancestry, oceanic gods. It's a story anyone can insert themselves into, especially in a world where identity feels increasingly fragmented. Perhaps, too, it is the comfort of suspicion. The thrill of thinking that the world still hides secrets too vast and strange for official history. The idea that somewhere, along a coast washed by Atlantic fog, a story persists not because it is true, but because it feels like it should be. And if one begins to dream of cities beneath the sea, or hears strange rhythms in the surf, who can say where the fiction ends? The myth of Innsmouth survives because it offers something no official record can: the possibility that the world is still haunted, not by spirits, but by bloodlines, by stories that refuse to die, and by gods who do not seek to be worshipped, only remembered. Whether the sightings are real, whether the reefs are charted or not, may be irrelevant. The myth is alive, and in a very real sense, that is enough. The next section will trace how these ideas, once confined to regional whispers, have permeated film, games, and music, spreading not just through rumor, but through art that dares to ask, what if we are not alone and never were? The myth of Innsmouth did not remain confined to the printed page. Over the past century, it has infiltrated other mediums, cinema, interactive games, and music, transforming its legacy from literary horror to a wider cultural language. What began as a fictional tale of maritime ancestry and forbidden worship has become a thematic shorthand for transgression, secrecy, and the horror of biological destiny. The narrative's adaptability lies in its structure: a decaying town, a protagonist uncovering their own hybrid origins, and a submerged world that waits. Each of these elements lends itself naturally to visual and interactive interpretation, but consider carefully. With every adaptation, the myth mutates. Sometimes it is clarified, sometimes sensationalized. Yet the essence, the unease of being claimed by something older, remains remarkably intact. Stuart Gordon's film Dagon, 2001, is perhaps the most explicit adaptation of the shadow over Innsmouth, though it transposes the action from New England to the Spanish coastal town of Imboca. The plot remains familiar. A man discovers a town overtaken by a fish-worshipping cult, only to realize he is one of them. What's notable is the shift in tone. Where Lovecraft's story withheld its horror until the final act, Dagon is viscerally immediate, filled with grotesque imagery, gill-slit faces, amphibious priests, screaming transformations. The subtlety of Innsmouth's horror is replaced with spectacle. This is not a flaw, but a shift in medium logic. Cinema often demands revelation, yet in doing so, something is lost. The creeping epistemological dread that Lovecraft so carefully constructed. Gordon's film shows the deep ones. Lovecraft, more disturbingly, suggested that they had always been there. Other films borrow the Innsmouth framework without direct citation. Guillermo del Toro's The Shape of Water, 2017, reframes the aquatic hybrid not as horror, but as romantic allegory. The amphibious god creature, imprisoned and studied by military scientists, forms a tender relationship with a mute woman. The themes, human-non-human intimacy, the fluidity of identity, and the oppressive silence of institutions, echo Innsmouth in reverse. Here, the Deep One is not lurking in shadows, but framed with sympathy, even sanctity. Del Toro has frequently acknowledged Lovecraft's influence, and though The Shape of Water diverges radically in tone, it continues the conversation. It asks, what if the horror of transformation is not the loss of humanity, but the rediscovery of something deeper, more primordial, and perhaps more honest? In gaming, the influence of Innsmouth is even more pervasive. The Call of Cthulhu tabletop RPG, first published in 1981, cemented Innsmouth as a staple location. Scenarios often revolve around uncovering cultic activities, encountering Deep Ones, or navigating the decayed architecture of an abandoned New England port. These narratives reward investigation, but punish curiosity. Just as in the original story, knowledge costs sanity. Characters may survive, but they rarely emerge unchanged. Digital adaptations have continued this trend. Call of Cthulhu, Dark Corners of the Earth, 2005, places players in a first-person recreation of the shadow over Innsmouth, complete with a harrowing escape sequence through crumbling buildings and flooded tunnels. The mechanics mirror the narrative themes: sanity meters, distorted vision, voices whispering from the deep. The game does not just tell Lovecraft's story, it simulates the slow unraveling of identity under the weight of ancestral truth. More recently, games like Bloodborne, 2015, and The Sinking City, 2019, have invoked Innsmouthian motifs. Bloodborne, though ostensibly set in a Victorian nightmare, borrows heavily from Lovecraft's themes of his transformation, knowledge as contagion, and aquatic ascension. One of its late-game areas, the fishing hamlet, is a clear homage to Innsmouth, populated by warped aquatic villagers who worship eldritch sea beings. Meanwhile, the Sinking City blends open-world investigation with creeping genetic horror, placing players in a town slowly giving way to rising tides and rising madness. These works do not merely cite Lovecraft, they evolve him. In their mechanics, architecture, and environmental storytelling, they continue his most disturbing idea, that the world is not what it seems, and neither are we. Music, too, has been infected by Innsmouth's echo. In genres like dark ambient, drone, and metal, references to Dagon, Hydra, and the Deep Ones are common. Bands like Nile, the Great Old Ones, and Sulphur Aeon craft entire albums around Lovecraftian lore. Lyrics invoke Yihan Thle, bass lines churn like submarine earthquakes, and atmospheres swell with the weight of abyssal pressure. In these compositions, sound becomes metaphor, rhythm as ritual, distortion as genetic collapse, vocals as guttural invocations to the sea. Even outside heavy music, experimental artists have adopted Lovecraftian textures. Composer Brian Wrightsell's score for Hannibal, TV series 2013-2015, incorporates watery resonance and sonic dissonance that evoke Innsmouthian dream states, moments where perception dissolves into something slippery, alien, and submerged. The persistence of Innsmouth in these mediums raises a pressing question. Why does it endure? Partly it is because of its aesthetic coherence. The imagery, barnacled churches, glistening alleyways, amphibian chants, is rich and adaptable. But more deeply, Innsmouth speaks to a fear, both ancient and modern, that the self is not fixed, that one's past is a trap, and that the future may belong to something other than humans. In an age of climate collapse, rising seas, and genetic manipulation, the Deep Ones feel less like fiction and more like prophecy. The idea that the sea will return, and take us with it, has moved from myth to metaphor to plausible future. But unlike other apocalyptic visions, Innsmouth is not about destruction. It is about continuity. In every adaptation, the core remains the same. Transformation is inevitable. The question is not whether the cult is real, but whether it matters. Because once the tide rises, once the dream begins, once the blood remembers, it is no longer a matter of belief. It is a matter of return. In the next section, we will explore how this return has been embraced by academic thinkers, subcultural groups, and mythic reconstructionists who have taken the Innsmouth story beyond fiction and into lived philosophy, identity, and performance. In the decades since Lovecraft's death, the myth of Innsmouth has undergone an extraordinary cultural migration, from literary horror to lived metaphor, from fiction to philosophy, from myth to identity. This process of appropriation by artists, scholars, occultists, and subcultural communities has transformed what was once an imagined curse into a framework for belonging, performance, and even resistance. The Innsmouth bloodline, once a symbol of contamination, now often functions as an emblem of hybridity, of the refusal to be singular or pure. Consider carefully. The same myth that once reflected the author's anxieties about ancestry and degeneration has been reinterpreted as a celebration of multiplicity. Horror has become heritage. The first wave of this transformation came from academic reinterpretation. Beginning in the 1970s and accelerating through postmodern and psychoanalytic criticism, scholars began reading Lovecraft not as a pulp writer of cosmic nightmares, but as a mythographer of modernity's anxieties. Michel Houellebecq, in his H.P. Lovecraft, Against the World, Against Life, 1991, argued that Lovecraft's genius lay in his ability to depict the loss of anthropocentric confidence. Feminist and post-structuralist readings soon followed. Critics such as Barbara Creed and Elizabeth Rosen explored the shadow over Innsmouth as an allegory of the monstrous feminine and the collapse of bodily boundaries. In this framework, the hybrid bodies of the Innsmouth folk represent not pollution, but transgression, the breakdown of patriarchal binaries between self and other, human and non-human. Academic discourse reframed the myth as an early accidental treatise on the instability of the human category itself. Parallel to these critical analyses emerged a quieter, more esoteric movement, the ritual appropriation of Lovecraft's mythos within occult practice. During the 1970s and 80s, groups such as the Esoteric Order of Dagon, revived as a real-world collective, and the Typhonian OTO began incorporating Lovecraftian symbols and terminology into ceremonial magic. Kenneth Grant, a prominent figure in the Thelemic tradition, claimed that Lovecraft had unconsciously tapped into transmundane energies, that his stories were veiled transmissions from other dimensions. In this interpretation, Dagon and Hydra were not fictional entities but archetypal gateways to primal consciousness. Rituals invoking the Lords of the Deep were performed not as homage to literature, but as experiments in psychic transformation. These practices blur the line between parody and belief, showing how Lovecraft's invented pantheon, originally framed as atheistic metaphor, became absorbed into a living occult lineage. Once again, the myth transcended authorship. It began to behave as myths always do, autonomously. Meanwhile, subcultural aesthetics reimagined the Innsmouth legacy in visual and performative forms. In art and fashion, the Innsmouth look evolved into an aesthetic shorthand. For otherness, fish-scale textures, iridescent fabrics, bulging silhouettes. Avant-garde designers like Gareth Pugh and Iris van Herpen have drawn inspiration, knowingly or not, from the hybrid morphology Lovecraft described. In online spaces, the Innsmouth motif has been reclaimed by communities exploring queerness, neurodivergence, and post-human identity. On Tumblr and TikTok, users jokingly call themselves Sea Spawn or Children of Dagon, blending humor with self-acceptance. What was once described as deformity becomes iconography. "We all come from the sea," reads one viral post. "Some of us just remember better." This ironic reclamation functions as both meme and manifesto, a playful but pointed critique of social norms that pathologize difference. In digital folklore, to be Innsmouthian is to be proudly unassimilable. Academically, the myth has also become a lens through which to interrogate environmental and ecological philosophy. Scholars of eco-criticism, such as Jeffrey Jerome Cohen and Timothy Morton, have referenced Lovecraft as a proto-theorist of the Anthropocene sublime, the terror of recognizing humanity's insignificance within planetary systems. The deep ones, in this reading, symbolize the continuity of life beyond human temporality. Their return is not apocalypse, but ecological correction, the sea reclaiming what land has corrupted. The shadow over Innsmouth, then, becomes an allegory for climate anxiety. The rising tides of the 21st century make the story newly prophetic. The ocean no longer waits at the horizon. It advances, inevitable, indifferent, sacred. The myth thus shifts from racial to environmental inheritance, the return not of contaminated blood, but of the planet itself. Within literary and cultural theory, the Innsmouth myth has also been folded into discussions of the weird as a philosophical category. Thinkers like Graham Harman and Eugene Thacker position Lovecraft as a precursor to object-oriented ontology and speculative realism. In this framework, the Deep Ones are not monsters, but manifestations of the non-human real, entities that exist beyond human comprehension or moral framing. The Innsmouth story, when viewed through this lens, enacts a collapse of anthropocentrism. The horror arises from the encounter with being that is indifferent to human perception. Knowledge here is not enlightenment, but dissolution. This philosophical reframing has allowed the Innsmouth myth to enter academic discourse not as pulp, but as phenomenology, a study of how it feels when the world no longer centers us. Across subcultures, academic institutions, and spiritual experiments, the myth continues to mutate, adapting to each new context like a species responding to pressure. Its persistence lies in its fluidity. It can be read as racism confronted or undone, as metaphor for mental illness, as critique of environmental collapse, or as invitation to mystical re-enchantment. In every instance, the core dynamic remains. Humanity's boundaries are porous, and the sea, whether literal, psychological, or planetary, will reclaim what was always its own. And so, in these appropriations, we find not parody, but continuity. Lovecraft's dread of hybridity becomes the world's fascination with it. The cults of Innsmouth, once whispers in fiction, now exist as metaphors for identity, ecology, and philosophy alike. Yet the question remains, does this reclamation tame the myth or deepen it? If we celebrate the Deep Ones as emblems of inclusivity, do we forget their deeper message, that transformation is never safe, and the self that emerges from the tide is never the same as the one that entered it? In the final section, we will confront that question directly, tracing the psychological and philosophical implications of a world where humanity's boundaries dissolve, and the sea's memory finally speaks through us. To engage with the myth of Innsmouth is to confront a series of psychological and philosophical dilemmas that extend far beyond the pages of fiction. It is not merely a horror story, nor even just a mythology. It is an idea that the human self is provisional, that ancestry may override autonomy, and that beneath the rational surface of identity, something ancient, submerged, and inhuman still waits. This idea, once planted, does not easily leave the mind. It lingers not because of its monsters, but because of its implications. And while its forms have evolved, from story to symbol, from cultural fear to philosophical metaphor, the core remains unchanged. What if the self is not whole? What if it is inherited? What if it is already lost? The first and most immediate psychological implication of the Innsmouth myth is its challenge to personal identity. In The Shadow over Innsmouth, the narrator undergoes a profound unraveling. What begins as curiosity about a decaying town ends with the realization that he carries that town inside him, its blood, its future, its memory. His final acceptance, "I shall dwell with the others in that glorious city of the deep," is not defeat, but alignment. This mirrors what psychologists term the return of the repressed. A buried truth, as once uncovered, reconfigures the self. But unlike therapeutic models, which suggest integration leads to healing, the Innsmouth model suggests that integration erases the self entirely. It is not recovery, it is replacement. To know who you are is to surrender who you thought you were. This has profound resonance with contemporary psychological anxieties. In an age increasingly shaped by questions of identity, racial, sexual, neurological, ancestral, the fear that one might not be who one believes themselves to be is no longer confined to fiction. DNA testing, trauma theory, and the exploration of ancestral memory all open psychic doors that, once breached, cannot be easily closed. To discover that one carries an unexpected lineage, or that one's behavior reflects inherited patterns, is to brush against the same terror that Lovecraft's narrator faces. the collapse of individual sovereignty. The Innsmouth myth, in this sense, serves as an allegory for what modern psychology already suggests, that the self is porous and the past exerts strange gravity. Philosophically, the implications are even more unsettling. At the heart of Lovecraft's worldview lies the proposition that the universe is not centered on human meaning. The Deep Ones, and by extension the Innsmouth bloodline, embody a worldview in which life continues, intelligence persists, and civilization thrives, but without us. They do not hate humanity, they simply do not need it. Their gods are not moral, but metabolic. Their rituals do not invoke transcendence, but repetition. Their eternity is not linear, but tidal. This reveals something profound. The horror of Innsmouth is not death. It is irrelevance. Humanity is not threatened by extinction. It is threatened by replacement within a system that continues effortlessly without it. Consider the parallels to ecological philosophy. The Anthropocene has taught us that the Earth does not belong to us, and that its systems, climatic, geological, biological, operate on scales of time and meaning far beyond our comprehension. In this context, the Deep Ones become more than monsters. They are symbols of post-human continuity. They will outlive us, just as they predated us. Their cities beneath the waves are not fantasies but metaphors for what remains when human history ends. This is the shift from existentialism to extinctionism. Not, why do I exist, but what happens after me? The myth of Innsmouth answers, something remembers, something waits. But this line of thought cannot be contained within horror or philosophy alone. It creeps into the edges of myth and theology, into the space where the divine is less about worship and more about structure. Lovecraft's gods do not offer salvation, they offer continuity. And that continuity is biological. The Deep Ones reproduce, they integrate, they return. In this, they fulfill a role once reserved for divine archetypes, the bridge between mortal and eternal. Yet they do so without promise, without love, without transcendence. They do not invite belief, they assume it, because it is written not in doctrine, but in blood. This is the inversion of religion, where once we prayed to ascend beyond flesh, the cults of Innsmouth descend into it, trusting not in spirit, but in species. We must also acknowledge the psychological allure of such myths. For all their horror, the Innsmouth stories also offer a strange kind of comfort, the erasure of choice, the seduction of inevitability. To belong to something ancient, to be guided by dreams, to return to the sea, it is not hard to see how this could feel like resolution. No more uncertainty, no more identity crises, just surrender. For some readers, particularly those estranged from cultural belonging or wounded by the demands of modern selfhood, this myth of return speaks to a buried longing, the desire to be claimed. It is not dissimilar to how people speak of cults or lost homelands or imagined past lives. The horror is seductive precisely because it ends the burden of being alone. And so, we arrive at an impasse. The Innsmouth myth has proven enduring because it speaks to fears we cannot outgrow. Fear of being replaced, fear of being absorbed, fear that our autonomy is an illusion. Yet it also speaks to desires we dare not confess. The desire to belong absolutely, the desire to shed identity, the desire to return to something older than choice. Whether interpreted through psychology, philosophy, or theology, the myth leaves no easy exit. It does not conclude, it submerges. And perhaps that is its most enduring effect, that once encountered, it alters the shape of thought itself. Even now, decades after its creation, the cults of Innsmouth persist, not in ruins or reefs or bloodlines we can trace, but in ideas we cannot unthink. They wait not beneath the sea, but beneath our assumptions, about who we are, what we inherit, and how far back our dreams remember. The tide never truly recedes. It only waits,